Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Napoleon in Egypt Battle of the Pyramids by Epic History TV. Now this isn't the first time we've covered Napoleon in Egypt. We did extra history series on the topic, but I know a lot of people, including myself, have been very excited to see Epic History series on Napoleon's Egyptian expedition, since they do such a fantastic job with the other Napoleonic content. I'm very excited to jump into this one. If you guys end up enjoying this one, then please leave a like, subscribe, all that good stuff. And with all of that out of the way, let's get right into it. To destroy England thoroughly, the time is coming when we must seize Egypt. Napoleon to the Directory, August 1797.
May 1798. A massive French invasion force sails across the Mediterranean. 55,000 men aboard more than 300 ships, escorted by 13 ships of the line.
It's a big fleet.
Aboard the most powerful of these, the 120-gun L'Orient, sails General Napoleon Bonaparte. France's celebrated hero of the war in Italy has received new orders from his government. He is to lead an expeditionary force east to Egypt,
Yes.
the wealthiest province of the Ottoman Empire. And to all educated Europeans, an ancient land of mystery and wonder.
Yeah, and since we're getting a little bit into it, it's worth asking the question, why did Napoleon head to Egypt? Right, it may not be the most obvious thing if you're unfamiliar with the history. So as they mentioned, Napoleon has come back to France after his first Italian campaign. He is a sort of patriotic military hero. He's pretty well known, in part thanks to his military success, in part thanks to his brilliant propaganda. So Napoleon's well known, and he's found great success in Italy. Now, France has to ask itself, alright, what do we do next? Who's their biggest enemy at this time, and who, frankly, will remain to be their biggest enemy? Britain. They're always having issues with Britain, right? France, master of land, Britain, master of the seas. And so, the French and Napoleon ask themselves, alright, what can we do to take on the Brits? Can we invade the UK? That's probably not going to work, right? They have such a strong navy, it's extremely risky to try and cross the English Channel. I know it's not very big, but any crossing involves taking on the Royal Navy. Alright, so maybe that's not an opportunity. And the French had been thinking about invading Britain, or maybe going in through Ireland, or there had been thoughts about this, but they sort of decided, alright, this isn't the way to go. What if we sort of attacked Britain more indirectly? You know, what makes Britain so powerful? Well, their sort of growing global trade empire. Why don't we take a jab at that? Okay, what if we headed to Egypt? That'll cut Britain off from their very important colony of India. That will improve our global position, right? Maybe we can start to take some of that global British trade hegemony. If you think about the position of the French Empire right now, French interests in the Caribbean are quite challenged. First, by British dominance of the Atlantic, and secondly, by the Haitian Revolution, right? So there's a couple of reasons why Napoleon is like, all right, why don't we head for Egypt? In addition to, and they just mentioned it here, and I don't think this was the driving factor, but this is definitely an important part of it. There is sort of a nascent, developing Orientalism. Egyptomania is what it will come to be called, a growing interest in Egypt. You know, if we think about the 18th century, the Enlightenment, there's been so much interest in these classical civilizations, Greece, Rome. Some of that is starting to shift towards Egypt, and Napoleon's expedition will very much enhance that growing interest, but it's already there. And the Directory, you know, Napoleon presents this to them, and they're like, it's not the worst idea in the world. Also, we're starting to get a little bit worried about you, Napoleon. We'll send you off to Egypt, right? Sort of get you out of our hair for a minute, right? So, that, and there's a whole lot more to it, but broadly is why they decide to sail for Egypt.
After 6 years of war in Europe,
Oh, they're probably about to explain what I just said. I should wait a little bit.
French Republic
Sorry, like I said, we've done another series on this, so, I'm prepped and ready to talk about Egypt.
faces one last remaining enemy, Great Britain.
Right. Because, Napoleon's Italian campaign, he has absolutely dunked on the Austrians. They have been, of course, they will, conflict will continue, but for now, they have sort of been knocked out of the war. And so France is feeling pretty good about itself, but Britain is always there to annoy them.
The conquest of Egypt will strike a powerful blow against the British,
Right.
disrupting their trade in the eastern Mediterranean and threatening their connections to India and the East.
Right, and you can see how, we talked about, if we think about the sort of colonial empires of this time, France has lost a lot of its American colonies, but it still has an interest in the Caribbean, particularly Saint-Domingue, which is Haiti. But Britain has so much power over the Atlantic Ocean, France is sort of turning closer to home. They're thinking, all right, well, we are a Mediterranean country in some ways, right? You don't typically think of France when you think of the Mediterranean, but as you can see, they're along the Mediterranean. They're thinking, why don't we try and control the Mediterranean, right? We can turn this into our own little French Sea. We can cut the British off, ideally, because we're having some issues in the Atlantic. And now it's not that I don't want to emphasize British naval dominance too much, because it will increase over time. It's not like there's no competition over the Atlantic. In fact, Britain and France are fighting over it. So I don't want to give you the false impression that the Atlantic, yeah, that was just Britain. No, it's not like that. But France is sort of like, what if we tried with the Mediterranean, right? Maybe that would be more in our wheelhouse.
These profitable trade networks help fuel the British war effort.
Right.
What's more, it will extend France's revolutionary, civilizing mission to
Yeah.
the people of Egypt, liberating them from superstition and feudalism.
It's sort of interesting because, oftentimes this is seen as sort of a colonial mission. And, in many ways it was. But if you look at what France is doing back in Europe, a lot of that is kind of colonial as well. This, in some ways, is different, but in some ways is an extension of what France has already been doing in Europe. It goes into these different countries, it overthrows the government, and it sets up these, sister republics that are very friendly to France, and they run things how the French want them to run things. So they are sort of extending this liberalizing, civilizing mission that, they have been doing in Europe to Egypt. Now, it is a little bit different in character, and we'll see that throughout this video, and I think we'll do more videos on this in the future. This goes a little differently than some of the campaigns in Europe do, but there is, some of these similar ideas behind it. France thinks it is this great enlightened empire, and it must impose its enlightenment on the rest of the world, right? It's not the kind of enlightenment that you convince other people of. You force them to accept it, or at least that's sort of how France sees it. That's one of their justifications for the French Revolutionary Wars. So this is also kind of like that. It's part of that.
France's corrupt and avaricious government, the Directory, sees two further benefits from...
We have the Directory here. As they said, a very corrupt government. These are men looking out for only themselves, looking out for only their own survival. We have Paul Barras in the middle here. He was an early patron of Napoleon. He really helped Napoleon rise through the ranks. At this point, as we get to sort of 1798, the Egyptian campaign, all of the Directory, including Barras, is starting to feel a little bit threatened by Napoleon, right? Napoleon's gotten very popular, very powerful. They're worrying about him becoming a Caesar of sorts, right? Winning glory through conquest, winning support from the public and his soldiers, and then marching back to Paris and taking over. And so they think, well, why don't we send him off to Egypt? Which is kind of funny because one of the things Napoleon has in his mind when he goes to Egypt is that, I'll be just like the conquerors of the ancient world, just like Alexander and Caesar. So this is sort of enhancing Napoleon's Caesar complex in some ways, but they just kind of want to get him out of there.
The campaign, the opportunity to acquire tremendous riches, and to get the alarmingly popular and ambitious General Bonaparte far away from Paris.
Yeah, get him away from France!
Plots and coups are never far from anyone's mind.
Yeah.
Napoleon is thrilled by the expedition, which he has done much to promote and organize himself. It is a chance to win fresh glory and to walk in the footsteps of his heroes, Julius Caesar and Alexander the Great.
Exactly. Now look, there are practical reasons for the expedition to Egypt. I mean, we've just laid them out in the first couple minutes of this video, but with Napoleon, you always got to look at his sort of personal ambition, and frankly, I think, though there are practical reasons to do this, a lot of the reason why Napoleon wanted to do this comes from his sort of personal motivations, his ambition, the idea he had of himself as in the model of one of these ancient conquerors, wanting to be like Alexander, wanting to be like Caesar, wanting to go conquer this foreign land, build this empire. You know, I think there was something sort of intriguing and exotic about Egypt, about the East, right? This is sort of where we start to see the developing Orientalism. So I do think a lot of this is driven by Napoleon's personal ambition. But once again, that doesn't mean that there were no sort of logical or broader reasons for this to happen. There were.
Like Alexander, Napoleon even has fanciful notions
of
marching on to India to attack the British there. Europe is a molehill, he had told his secretary, Bourrienne. We must set off for the Orient. That is where all the greatest glory has been achieved.
He really sees himself in the model of an Alexander. Though, at this point, 1798, we're reaching the year 1800, the new century. A lot of these ideas are no longer really applicable. Europe is a molehill. Maybe in the time of Alexander, but not really at this point, which is probably one of the reasons why, not to spoil anything, but I think we all know Napoleon will not end up forming a sort of Middle East Asian empire. No, his empire will be back in Europe.
But the Mediterranean is dangerous water for the French.
Oh yeah.
While the Republic's armies have won great victories on land, Britain has cemented its status as the dominant naval power of the age.
Yep.
Decisive victories over French allies, the Spanish at Cape St. Vincent, and the Dutch at Camperdown.
And that's what I was saying, Britain will further cement its naval dominance, but it is in the process of cementing its naval dominance. And at this point, it's very clear that Britain has the upper hand, right? That's the point I was making earlier. Like, no, it's not like Britain is, if you'd asked someone at the time, it's not like they would have said, yeah, Britain will be the master of the seas for decades to come. That would have been a little presumptuous, but it was clear that who was the master of the seas at that moment? Britain was. Now, maybe that would be challenged. Maybe France thought, all right, we can perhaps in the long term take them on, but that was the reality of the moment.
Rear Admiral Sir Horatio Nelson and his squadron of 14 ships of the line now prowl the Mediterranean,
searching for the French.
Nelson knows a large French fleet has just left Toulon, but does not know its destination, which remains a closely guarded secret.
It was very much kept under wraps. A very few people knew where they were going. And as you can imagine, one of the reasons we have to explain why Napoleon's going to Egypt is because it is not sort of the obvious conclusion to the question, what will Napoleon do next, right? And so it's kept under wraps, and rather successfully, a lot of the French soldiers don't know where they're going, and the Brits don't know either. But we have Nelson prowling the waters. Nelson, who at this point, still pretty early in his career, still is making a name for himself, but has yet to really make a big name for himself. But don't worry, this expedition will play a role in that.
Undetected, the French expedition sails south along the
Yep,
Italian
they
coast.
sneak past. And
On the night-
funnily enough, I mean, we can see Napoleon's place of birth here. He is Corsican. He's from an island, but Napoleon is very much a landlubber. He is a general of the land. He is not much of a seafarer.
5th of June, it arrives off Malta.
Stop one.
The island is ruled by the Knights of St. John, a religious military order dating back to the Crusades. But the French have decided that they want it for a naval base.
Yes.
A thorn in the side of the British.
And, I mean, you can imagine, we don't have the map up right now, but with its positioning, it's a pretty important base in the Mediterranean. Now we're looking at the Knights of Malta. We don't need to go into it too much, but basically they had been sort of Christian defenders against the Muslim Ottomans for hundreds of years. At this point, that role is a little bit outdated. They're more sort of Christian pirates preying on sort of Muslim merchant vessels. That is more what they're doing by 1798. They're not really performing their glorious holy mission anymore because it's sort of a mission of the past, or is becoming a mission of the past. They're mostly just keeping their order alive and plundering merchant vessels.
In 1565, the Knights had famously held out against a vast Ottoman army for 3 months.
A vast siege. It was a very grand, impressive siege. 1565, this is when we talk about that sort of idealized mission. Not that any idealized mission is ever really true, but this is sort of the height of it. The Knights of Malta as the defenders of the Christian world against the Ottoman Empire. Once again, I think most of that rhetoric is always overblown, but they really did resist this massive, massive Ottoman siege.
Now, despised by the locals, divided amongst themselves, the Knights surrender to Napoleon in just 2 days.
Despised by the locals, despised by a lot of sort of Arab merchants for their piracy. They're not doing so hot at this point. And they initially refused Napoleon entry, but they've got no chance. They've got the might of Napoleon and the French army up against them. After a little bit, they're like, okay, we'll let you in. Plus, these are no longer the Knights of 1565, who were this, elite military order. They've really sort of deteriorated at this point, and so they see the writing on the wall, and they're like, all right, we'll let you in, Napoleon.
During his 6 days in Malta, Napoleon overhauls its archaic government, establishes schools, abolishes slavery, and requisitions money and supplies. Then he sails for Egypt.
Yeah, so just a brief note on Malta. The order, it will sort of survive in one way or another, but the Knights of Malta, as a sovereign order, sovereign state, are basically done. Napoleon does what he does everywhere, and we saw this in Italy. He sort of spreads these French revolutionary liberal ideals. I find this one of the most fascinating parts of Napoleon, because there's always the question of, did Napoleon continue the French Revolution, or did he end it? Right? He crowns himself Emperor of France eventually, and he does become more conservative as time continues. So in some ways, he is very much an enemy of the revolution. In other ways, he spreads these revolutionary ideals throughout Europe, and Malta's another example of that. He brings modern administration, freedom of speech, schools, a library, abolishes slavery, all of these sort of liberal-type policies. And an interesting thing, two things on Malta. One is that he actually picks up some Arabic translators from Malta. As you can imagine, being positioned as they are, well, first of all, you can see why it's such an important naval base. And second of all, they have a lot of contact with the Arab world. And going to Egypt, Napoleon will need Arab translators. And that abolition of slavery is interesting. I mean, part of that is sort of the liberal policy. Part of that is, in some ways, a bit of an appeal to the Islamic world. Because as we said, the Knights are raiding these Arabic merchant vessels, taking slaves, and so Napoleon's like, hey, I'm going to free the slaves. So that's sort of maybe makes him look good in the eyes of the Islamic or the Arab worlds, that he's taking on, the Knights of Malta, that they basically see as sort of these slave-taking pirates. So there's a bit of, once again, Napoleon trying to sell himself again.
Leaving General Vaubois and a 5,000-strong garrison to hold the island. But where is the Royal Navy?
Good question.
Back in May, Nelson's squadron had been dispersed by gales. He has now regrouped, correctly guessed Napoleon's destination, and is racing to intercept. If he can catch the French, British seamanship and gunnery all but guarantee the destruction of Napoleon's fleet. Then, a lucky break for the French.
Seriously lucky.
On the night of the 22nd, Nelson's squadron passes within a few miles of the French fleet. But thanks to heavy fog and darkness, neither side is even aware of the other's presence.
They literally pass by each other and don't, or at least the British don't realize that they're passing by Napoleon's fleet. That is, I mean, we've said this a couple times on this channel, referring to people like Napoleon and Caesar, but to be one of these quote-unquote great men of history, you need a lot of things, you need talent, you need skill, charisma, whatever. You need a lot of things. One thing you need is luck, and that is pure luck.
The British squadron sails on to Alexandria, where they find no sign of the French. An exasperated Nelson waits 24 hours before heading north to continue his search.
So close.
Just hours later, the first of Napoleon's ships arrive off Alexandria.
So close. Soldiers, you're about to undertake a conquest whose effects on civilization and trade are incalculable. We will make exhausting marches. We will fight several battles. We will succeed in all our enterprises. Destiny is for us. Napoleon to his army, June 28th, 1798. A typical grand, dramatic, inspiring Napoleon speech, right?
Napoleon, aware that British warships are in the area, wants to disembark as quickly as possible. 5,000 French infantry go ashore at night, storm Alexandria the next morning, and quickly overpower its garrison. The rest of the French army lands safely.
And in the storming of Alexandria, Jean-Baptiste Kléber, who was one of Napoleon's men who eventually will be left in charge of this expedition, is actually shot in the head during the storming of the city, but survives. He's sort of shot in the forehead. I imagine sort of grazed in the forehead. It's maybe, shot in the head sounds very dramatic, but it technically is. But it seems that it didn't do much actual damage, and he survives and is fine after that. But that's pretty remarkable. Yeah, the French face sort of some resistance from the local garrison, but don't have much trouble storming in and taking the city.
Napoleon has brought 38,000 troops to Egypt, mostly veterans of the Army of Italy.
Right.
The 5 infantry divisions are commanded by Generals Bon, Desaix, Kléber, Menou, and Renier. The single
Hey, there's Kléber I was just talking about. And we've got some interesting characters here. I think that the Egyptian expedition's interesting because when we look at Napoleon's subordinates, we have a mix of important people. Some of his subordinates that will go on to serve alongside him throughout his career, and then others, like a Menou or a Kléber, who are most known for their service in Egypt, and after this often get forgotten about by history.
Cavalry division is led by the towering figure of Thomas Alexandre Dumas.
Yes.
He is France's first black general, born in what's now Haiti, to a French aristocrat and enslaved African woman. He has already won fame for his actions in Italy, where the Austrians had nicknamed him the Black Devil. There are more familiar faces from it.
And before we get to that, I want to talk a little bit about Dumas. We've done a reaction on Dumas. I think he's an absolutely fascinating character. He's a cavalry officer. He's born in Saint-Domingue, as they said, the colony that will become Haiti, to an enslaved mother and a white French aristocratic father. And interestingly, he is manumitted or freed by his father and brought to France to be educated. Now, this is something that is in some ways sort of particular to Saint-Domingue culture, in that there was a lot of mixing between white men and enslaved African women, and so this resulted in a lot of mixed-race children, people of color, who sometimes would be kept as slaves, other times would actually be freed and educated and trained to take over their father's estates. Now, this is something, if we look at, say, the American chattel slavery system, as in the United States, this is something that was much, much more rare, that would have been very unusual and not very acceptable in the sort of social situation of the United States. In Saint-Domingue, this was a lot more normal. And so you have people like Dumas, you have other important Haitian leaders, someone like Toussaint Louverture, who is born a slave and later manumitted. And Dumas will become this black man, this Haitian, become this very important cavalry officer in Europe. He's a really fascinating character. He's also the father of Alexandre Dumas, Thomas Alexandre Dumas, and Alexandre Dumas, who writes Count of Monte Cristo, Three Musketeers, very famous novelist and playwright. So I think Dumas is a really, really interesting character.
Italy, Napoleon's chief of staff, the indefatigable
Yeah, and here I reckon we get Berthier. Probably other faces we're going to see are those people that would remain important to Napoleon.
Berthier. And brigade commanders, Generals Murat, Lannes, and Marmont.
Mm-hmm.
The army is also accompanied by 167 scientists, scholars, artists, and assorted experts.
Right.
Even a hot air balloonist.
Yes.
Collectively, they are known as the savants, and have come to study Egypt's historical and natural wonders.
Right, and that is another really interesting and somewhat underrated part of this expedition, is that, it's not entirely a military expedition. There is sort of an academic part of it, and this very much relates to, like we were talking about in the beginning, there were sort of military, trade, economic, political reasons for this expedition to happen, but it was also influenced by this growing Orientalism, this growing interest in Egypt, what will become known as Egyptomania. And so this is part of that. A lot of French people, a lot of French, the intellectual class are becoming interested in ancient Egypt, but they don't have a ton of access to it. In fact, they don't have a ton of access to a lot of ancient Greek stuff either, because that is also within the Ottoman Empire, though, in a couple decades it will not be. And so they want to investigate Egypt. What can we find? The architecture, the history, all of this stuff. And when they bring this back to Europe, and they will discover some really fascinating stuff like the Rosetta Stone, this will, only encourage that interest in Egypt even further.
But they and Napoleon find Alexandria a bitter disappointment.
Well, yeah.
The fabled city of antiquity, founded by Alexander himself, has been reduced by centuries of earthquakes and neglect to a ramshackle town of 6,000 inhabitants.
Yeah, they will find a lot of interesting stuff, but largely the French soldiers, and of course we particularly have the writings of the officers more than the common soldiers, are pretty disappointed by what they find in Egypt, because, and that's partially on them, because if you think about it, they are coming to Egypt with images of Alexander the Great and ancient Egypt and Cleopatra in their heads, right? That's what they're thinking of when they come to Egypt. Man, it has been thousands of years since that was Egypt. It's gone through a lot of changes, and they just don't find what they're expecting, and they are often really disappointed by what they do find, because it's been built up so much in their imaginations, and so what they do find is quite disappointing to many of them. And, it's interesting, they come And you see this, well, frankly, with a lot of empires, but just if we're using sort of the French Empire of this era as an example, France had this sort of liberal enlightenment mission to, enlighten the world and force other countries into becoming as enlightened as them. This sort of like liberal mission, but they also very much looked down on other people, right? So it's this odd combination, and you very much see this in Egypt, where France does the whole, and once again, I think you see this a lot with sort of hegemonic empires. They do the whole, we're here to help you, even if you don't know it. And everyone's like, the Egyptians are like, well, what if we don't want your help? And the French are like, well, too bad. And once again, we very much see it here, but hey, we see it in Switzerland as well. When France invades and turns them into the Helvetic Republic, the Swiss say, hey, what if we don't want your help? And France says, too bad. Looks like you need it.
Egypt is nominally ruled by the Ottoman Empire.
Right.
In reality, power lies with local Mamluk warlords. Two in particular.
And by the way, the Mamelukes, who, like they said, Egypt is basically autonomous under Mamluk rule, even though it's part of the Ottoman Empire. The Mamelukes were a sort of class of slave soldiers and administrators who had become sort of the political elites of Egypt, political and military elites. It's a really interesting system. Because, I think when people think of slavery, they often think of American chattel slavery. And of course, that was very present in the time period we're talking about. But there are other really interesting examples. Another Ottoman example is the Janissaries. Christian children taken, made into these slave soldiers, educated in Islam, converted, taught Turkish and Arabic. And eventually the Janissaries would become this elite class of soldiers and would have a lot of power within the Ottoman Empire. So I think it's sometimes sort of interesting for people who are unfamiliar with this to hear that you have a class of slave soldiers or slave administrators who become the political elite in whatever context we're talking about. It seems like an oxymoron, but that is exactly what happened.
Murad Bey and Ibrahim Bey. Mamluks were originally slave soldiers,
right,
who once served the Islamic Caliphate. Superb horsemen and fearless warriors, they now rule Egypt with an iron fist, expropriating its wealth and leaving its peasants in poverty.
Yeah, they're very much ruling for their own interests. There was a lot of fighting in between the Mamelukes, sort of jockeying for power, trying to grab the top position. They're not necessarily ruling in the interests of their people. And, they've managed to be autonomous from the Ottoman Empire, but now they are confronted with a wholly new threat, the French under Napoleon.
To most Egyptians, they are despised foreign overlords.
Yeah.
A situation that Napoleon hopes to exploit with clever propaganda.
He very
to
much
the people
does.
of Egypt, he proclaims, I am come to restore your rights and punish usurpers. I reverence God, his prophet, and the Quran.
Yeah, and maybe we'll talk about this later in the video. I imagine we will once we get to French administration, but as they covered, the Mamelukes are not very liked by the local Egyptians. And so Napoleon comes by and he says, basically, I'm a liberator. You hate the Mamelukes? Well, I'm better than them, right? The quote on the screen sort of says it all. I'm going to restore your rights, punish the Mamelukes, and also he makes the argument, I respect Islam more than they do, which, might seem a little crazy, but the Mamelukes, though they are Muslim, they don't necessarily adhere to the religion very closely. And Napoleon tries to make the case that, I respect Islam, I'm a friend of Islam, I respect your culture and your religion, I'm a better defender of the faith than they are. And, so that's, I think we'll get more into that later. If we don't, then I'll just talk about it later. But that is going to be an important thing throughout this expedition, Napoleon trying to sell himself in this way. Though interesting to note, I think especially early on in the expedition, I mentioned that he picked up those Maltese Arabic translators. Some of his proclamations early on were not translated super well because, these Maltese translators, they, sort of had passing Arabic or basic Arabic, maybe not high enough of a level to get across some of these big ideas that Napoleon wanted to communicate. Now, I'm sure that improved as Napoleon's campaign continued. I'm sure he picked up some locals who could translate for him. Or, at least some other people who were living in the area who knew French and knew Arabic very well. But I just think it's sort of interesting that early on, I'm sure some of these proclamations were maybe not as grand and impactful as Napoleon wanted them to be, because they were not translated quite so well.
Meanwhile, Murad and Ibrahim summon Mamluk warlords to the Al-Azhar Mosque in Cairo.
Very important spot in Islam, by the way, the Al-Azhar Mosque. In terms of religion and Islamic learning, this mosque is very important.
They agree to gather an army to crush the invaders.
Ooh.
Napoleon believes his best option is to strike quickly. Less than a day after his troops finish landing, he begins his advance on Cairo. But he misjudges the blistering climate.
He does.
And the barren, windswept landscape.
See, this is frankly a big mistake from Napoleon, right? This will not end up being good. They have to march through the desert. And the thing is, the distance is... I don't have the distance off the top of my head. The distance is not too far. It shouldn't take them that long to march. They've been marching up and down Italy, right? This should not be that big a deal, but I think Napoleon and those around him are just unfamiliar with Egypt, and they don't realize how difficult this is going to be with the heat and the lack of water and the lack of supplies as they're marching through wearing their wool coats, which of course they ditch very quickly, and carrying their supplies. That this ends up being a really... I don't think it's especially long, but it's a really grueling march through the desert.
He forces the pace, even after his men run out of water and are consumed by thirst. Hundreds collapse and die.
Yeah.
A few kill themselves to escape the suffering.
Yeah, it's pretty dire.
Bedouin horsemen circle the French like vultures. Stragglers that fall into their hands are robbed, tortured, and killed.
Yeah, this as well. The Bedouins sort of know not to directly engage with the French, but the French are in a bad state right now. When stragglers fall behind, well, they're done for, basically.
Even old comrades like Lannes and Murat are involved in heated conversations about Napoleon's decision-making.
Yes.
The army takes 4 days.
Okay, so it looks like they're going to leave it there, so I'll explain a little bit what they're talking about. Basically, there was a meeting held by Dumas. Well, we don't know a lot about this meeting. There's a lot of conjecture. It's very much debated what exactly happened. But it seems that it was held by Dumas and attended by a lot of Napoleon's officers, including Lannes and Murat, who, of course, were loyal and would go on to serve alongside him. And, the soldiers are very displeased. There's a lot of discontent after this forced march through the desert, and these officers ain't happy either. And so they come together and they voice their displeasure. Now, we don't know exactly what was going on. Some people frame this as this was basically a mutiny in development. They were going to mutiny and take over from Napoleon, whereas others say, no, they were just miserable from the days of marching through the desert, and they got together to complain about their boss, basically. I tend to think it's more the latter. I really don't think that this was any sort of... I really don't think it was that mutinous, and I think, frankly, once, they got water and supplies, and it had been a couple more days, it probably would have died down. But Napoleon found out about this meeting, of course, was very upset, and decided in particular to punish Thomas Alexandre Dumas, who we think had held the meeting, or at least hosted it, and that's what Napoleon thought as well. And so he punished him in particular. And after this point, Dumas, really falls out of Napoleon's favor, and he will play sort of a reduced role. And after the Egyptian expedition, he's he's one of those names that you don't see much of after this. He'll get captured in a couple years, whatever, but basically, because of this, his role in the Napoleonic Wars is very much reduced. I think it's maybe a little unfair, because I think it was more grumbling amongst the officers, and I think it was also unfair to pin it almost entirely on Dumas, but that is what happened. I think, in the long run, kind of Napoleon's loss. I mean, Dumas was a very skilled cavalry commander. I think it's a shame he had to go, and obviously, as you can tell, as I've told you, I find him fascinating, so, I also have a sympathy for him there. But that is what they're talking about when they say that people like Lannes and Murat were, talking about Napoleon. There is one particular meeting that they're referring to.
To cover the 45 miles to Damanhur, where mercifully they're able to rest, drink, and trade for food.
Right. And everybody sort of chills out a little bit after they get there. They get food, they get rest, they get drink. And Napoleon sort of rallies the troops. I mean, as we're about to see, they don't all abandon him, so it wasn't that bad. But I do think this does leave a sort of a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths. And you'll see that throughout this expedition, this is not the highest morale army Napoleon has ever led. In fact, there's sort of a lot of discontent throughout all of this. This is one of the peaks, and it'll die down, but even after this, people are sort of like, that was miserable. Is this worth it? And that's something that will increase, especially as we get deeper into this campaign.
It's not a moment too soon. News arrives that a large force of Mamluks under Murad Bey is approaching from the southeast.
Uh-oh.
The French advance to meet them at Shubrahit on the banks of the Nile. As 4,000 Mamluk horsemen come into view, the French marvel at their brightly coloured outfits, embellished with gold and jewels, and their many ornate weapons, including pistols, swords, daggers, and lances.
Yeah, the French are very impressed, and once again, there is sort of this exoticism to the East in the eyes of the French, and so these are their opponents, but they're very intrigued by them, frankly.
Murad boasts that he will sever Frenchmen's heads like slicing watermelons in a field.
Oh.
But for all their bravado and panache, the Mamluks have neither the discipline nor tactics to face a trained modern army.
Yeah.
When Napoleon forms his troops into giant squares, the Mamluk cavalry can only circle impotently, unable to break through the walls of French bayonets.
And frankly, there's a couple of key reasons why the French dominate so much against the Mamelukes. One is the mass French gunfire and artillery fire. The Mamelukes have just never faced anything on this scale or intensity. The second is the sort of professionalism of this modern French army. I mean, we talk about the development of a professional modernized army. The British army of this era is one we talk about. The French army of this era is one we talk about, especially under Napoleon. And then the third are the new tactics Napoleon is bringing. Now, Napoleonic tactics are wreaking havoc against his European opponents, right? And they also wreak havoc here. The infantry squares in particular, we've done a video on Napoleonic infantry tactics before, but the idea is to defend against cavalry. This mass of gunfire and bayonets. The horses simply refuse to approach or charge through it, and they'll just sort of ride around the squares. And this is used very, very effectively against the Mamelukes repeatedly during this expedition.
Scores are shot from the saddle. After 2 hours, the Mamluks call off their attack and retreat. They have suffered around 1,000 casualties. The French have scarcely lost a man.
Wow.
The victory is a much-needed morale boost for Napoleon's men after the hardships of the desert.
Yeah.
The Mamluks fall back to Mbaba, a small town on the banks of the Nile, across the river from Cairo.
We're going straight for Cairo.
Here, within sight of Egypt's fabled pyramids 9 miles to the south, they will face the invader with their full force.
Yeah, 9 miles to the south. So this is the so-called Battle of the Pyramids. This image even is misleading, but they just told us the real distance. In terms of the actual battle, the pyramids are quite far in the distance. You can see them, but they are far. And of course, this battle, this is one of these like little Napoleon propaganda tricks. You know, he thinks it's way more romantic and impressive for this battle to be beneath the shadow of the pyramids. And so it gets named the Battle of the Pyramids, and all of the paintings of it are the battle happening right beneath the pyramids, but that's not what happened, right? This is misleading. There's a lot of, I mean, you know, I don't know if y'all saw how this battle was portrayed in the Napoleon movie by Ridley Scott, but yeah, a lot of that is you didn't fire at the pyramids or the Sphinx or whatever. You know, this is, whenever you see anything too romantic or too dramatic, or you see great landmarks like the pyramids brought into it, always be skeptical, because it's usually something like this, where, yeah, they're in the background, but they are pretty far away, man. Soldiers, 40 centuries of history are looking down on you. Napoleon's address to his army, 21st July, 1798. And I mean, we can even see in his address to his own soldiers, Napoleon uses this romantic framing. I mean, when he talks to them, he says something like, you know, you can see the pyramids, you know, history's looking down, etc., etc. So, you know, this very romantic framing is inspiring to people after the fact, right? People want to see the paintings of the battle right in front of the pyramids and the accounts. But even at the time, Napoleon wants to tell his soldiers, like, hey, this is the importance of this, you know? And so that's even how he frames it. The blazing sun. I like that. It's a nice effect.
On the sweltering afternoon of the 21st of July, Napoleon's forces approach Mbaba. He has 25,000 men, organized into 5 giant divisional squares, with cavalry and baggage inside, and cannon at every corner.
The squares again?
Murad, with characteristic boldness, has crossed to the west bank of the Nile, leaving Ibrahim behind. Their forces total many thousands, but sources disagree wildly on just how many.
Yeah.
His elite Mamluk cavalry, 6,000 strong, are deployed between the small village of Biktil and the well-fortified town of Mbaba.
Yeah, the number of Mamluk soldiers does vary wildly. You know, sometimes you hear like 10, 20,000. Sometimes it's like 50, 60,000. I think it's on the lower end of that. And also, you have the sort of elite Mamluk cavalry, but aside from that, you know, a lot of these other Mamluk soldiers are sort of just like levies. You know, they're not well-trained professional soldiers. They're more like civilians barely armed for combat. It's sort of maybe a little more like feudal or medieval in style, right? And so, even if one of the bigger numbers is true, it's inflated by a lot of these sort of footmen, right? Versus, once again, the French, we are talking about a fairly modern, professionalized army.
Which is garrisoned by a mix of Ottoman infantry and peasant militia.
Right, exactly.
Napoleon's plan is simple: to drive through the enemy center and crush their right flank against the river. At 3:30 p.m., Desaix and Renier's divisions begin their advance. But as they move across the broken ground, their formation becomes disordered.
Uh-oh.
Murad spots his chance and unleashes his cavalry.
I mean, look, you know, Murad Bey, he's definitely bold. You gotta give him that. He was, you know, that man was bold, and he was willing to just go for it.
The Mamluks thunder forward at lightning speed. Desaix and Renier react just in time and close ranks. The French hold their fire until the last moment, then unleash a devastating volley. Horses and riders are sent tumbling. The survivors have no way to get to grips with the enemy, who continue pouring deadly fire into their midst.
Yeah, it's that. I mean, the squares, obviously, but one of the other points I made, it is just the mass of firepower the French have. I mean, it's remarkable, right? Like I said, the Mamluks just haven't faced anything like that. It is just an immense amount of gunpowder bearing down upon them. They don't know how to respond.
The Mamluks wheel back to regroup, but more charges meet the same result.
Yeah.
Many Mamluks simply give up and flee the field. Napoleon orders the divisions of Bon and Vienne.
There's also that where, once again, the Mamluks are not a sort of professionalized modern army. We've already talked about how, this is a sort of class of political elites that are often fighting with each other for political power. So the loyalty may not necessarily be there. Now, they understand that they have to fight together against the French, sure, but each man is looking out for himself, and if they think they've got no chance to win, they're just going to flee the field. Now, I mean, that can happen to, even professional armies at times, but I think the point I'm making is the Mamluks, or an individual Mamluk, might be more likely to say, you know what, I'm going to preserve my life and get the hell out of here.
To move forward. Once more, the Mamluk cavalry charge. Once more, the wave of horsemen shatters on French musketry and bayonets.
Yep.
With the enemy cavalry broken, Bon and Vival's men pour into Mbaba. It is a slaughter.
Yeah.
Those who are not killed flee into the Nile, where hundreds drown.
Yeah. By the way, Ibrahim Bey, over the bank of the Nile, seeing all of this happening, I'm not gonna move yet, but I may.
Murad Bey escapes with the remnants of his cavalry to Giza, from where he will withdraw to southern Egypt.
Yeah, Bey is out.
Ibrahim
Murad's out
Bey
of there.
Watches the calamity unfold across the river, then withdraws with his men back to Cairo.
Yeah, so, Murad Bey has gone very badly for him. He retreats further south. He'll keep retreating south after this. Ibrahim doesn't even get involved. And of course, there's sort of speculation like, well, what was Ibrahim doing? Was he being cautious? Did he see how the battle was going? He decided it wasn't worth risking his own men? Or was this a little more underhanded? Whenever anything like this happens, people point to betrayal. Because, it is sort of the more dramatic answer. But it may be true. I mean, Ibrahim is sort of the second-hand man to Murad. Maybe he wants to seize that top position. Maybe he says, I'm not going to help. I'm going to let Murad Bey get destroyed in there, and I'm going to be fine. Or maybe it's one of those other reasons. Of course, we don't know.
It is a crushing, one-sided victory.
Oh, yeah.
That takes just 2 hours.
It's a devastating, as we're about to see, devastating defeat for the Mamelukes and a major victory for the French. It really plays a big role in securing their control of Cairo and, Egypt more broadly.
More than 5,000 casualties.
Wow.
With heavy losses among their elite cavalry and leadership. French losses are less than 300.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Napoleon, with his usual flair for PR, decides this great victory will be known as the Battle of the Pyramids.
There you go.
Just in sight to the south.
Yeah, just in sight, barely.
On the 24th of July, Napoleon enters Cairo. Parts of the city are abandoned and in ashes after being torched by the Mamluks in their frantic withdrawal.
Yeah, and a lot of people had already fled the city by the time Napoleon arrived. Now, Cairo was a pretty big city, so there are a lot of people still there, but parts of the city have been torched. Some people have fled. It's not like he's finding the city in its best state.
Napoleon observes it would be difficult to find a richer land and a more wretched, ignorant, and brutish people.
See, and so that's I was talking about earlier. This sort of Napoleon comes with these grand Enlightenment liberal ideas, but also has this very sort of superior and colonial attitude towards the people of the country, right? I mean, he loves the ancient history. He has this idea of Egypt in his head, and yet the people of Egypt, they're a wretched, ignorant, and brutish people, right? We can sort of see that perspective here. And I mean, of course, this is a very sort of imperial perspective that we will see throughout the next century of European history and beyond.
Nonetheless, Cairo is the heart of Egypt.
Yeah.
A city of 600,000 inhabitants.
That's a big city. In 1798, I couldn't give you sort of comparative population counts for other cities, but that is a really big city.
It is in French hands.
It's really the key to controlling a whole lot of Egypt. I mean, the key is like the Nile Delta Valley or the Nile River Valley, whatever it's called. And the key to controlling that is Cairo. So you control Cairo, you've got a pretty firm foothold in Egypt. As you can see, Murad Bey will retreat. It's not like Napoleon has uncontested control of Egypt, but Cairo really is the key to that control.
Looks scattered and on the run, Napoleon's dream of Eastern conquest seems about to be realized.
Yeah, I mean, what could stop him now? He's defeated the Mamelukes decisively. I can't think of really any other power who could come along and mess this up.
Just 8 days later,
Uh-oh.
the dream is shattered.
Oh, no. Victory is not a name strong enough for such a scene. Rear Admiral Sir Horatio Nelson, 2nd of August. Uh-oh. What's gonna happen?
At sea, Nelson and the British Mediterranean Squadron have not given up their hunt for the French fleet.
No, they have not.
Finally, on the afternoon of the 1st of August, Nelson finds the French sheltering in Aboukir Bay. With 14 ships of the line against 13, he decides to attack that evening. The British
I mean, Nelson, very impressive admiral, very decisive. There's a reason he's so well known and well regarded. Well, by the way, this battle is part of why he becomes so well known. This is a massive victory. Sort of one of the interesting things about the battle is the French are sort of lined up against the bay in this sort of defensive formation, and Nelson manages to slip between them and the bay, which is an absolute disaster for the French defensive position. But because he's quick and he's decisive, he sees this opportunity, he seizes it, and he goes for it. It leads to this amazing victory for the British.
win a complete and stunning victory. The giant French flagship L'Orient is destroyed in a massive explosion. By the time it's over, the British have destroyed or captured 11 French ships of the line.
Yeah, I mean, this is a good image to pause on. Gives you an idea of how chaotic this battle was. A massive victory for the British, and the L'Orient's gunpowder magazine is hit. The massive French flagship explodes. It is like an explosion of impressive magnitude. And it's so shocking that even British ships will start picking up survivors from the explosion. That is how sort of massive this is. And after this battle and sort of the years following this battle, in some ways, I mean, it's remembered as a great British victory, but this explosion in particular of L'Orient is remembered as sort of a tragic event, like a humanitarian disaster that people on all sides of the war see as this really shocking thing. And in some ways, it becomes, at some points, a bit of a symbol for sort of the tragic losses that accompany this war more broadly. So yeah, it's this explosion. The magnitude of this explosion is both sort of physical and symbolic, but it all contributes to this really impressive British victory.
And taken more than 3,000 prisoners.
Wow.
With no fleet, Napoleon is stranded in Egypt. What's more, most of his army's cash has gone down with Lorient.
Yeah. And as they pointed out, it is worth sort of ruminating on how disastrous this is for the French. Now, the way they framed it is, Napoleon arrives in Cairo, all is well. This battle happens, all is ruined. It's not exactly like that, right? Like, there have been these massive victories against the Mamelukes, but as we've seen throughout this video, the land campaign was facing some issues as well. But I do not want to de-emphasize how devastating this French loss was. This is called the Battle of the Nile, which is another one of those romantic namings. More accurately, it's the Battle of Aboukir Bay, which is what I refer to it as. Basically, Napoleon is now completely cut off from France. The British, now they really control the Mediterranean. He cannot get reinforcements from France. He cannot get supplies from France. Even communication is difficult. It's really challenging to get information back and forth from Egypt to France. He is completely cut off. Now all Napoleon has are the men, whatever he has right now, that's what he has. And this is pretty disastrous. He is far from home. One of the points of this whole mission was to sort of improve French domination of the Mediterranean, or not even improve it, but create it, right? To establish, why did they take Malta? Well, it was an important naval base. Why did they take Egypt? Well, they wanted to cut Britain off for India. They wanted to turn the Mediterranean into a French-dominated sea, all of these things. And this is not that. In fact, this is the opposite of that. Now the Brits dominate the Mediterranean. This is, really a disaster for the French. It's amazing for the British, an amazing victory that lends, young Admiral Nelson a lot of popularity amongst the British public. And, of course, the military and political channels of Britain as well.
But Napoleon does not despair. If anything, he is invigorated by the crisis.
I mean, it's Napoleon, of course he doesn't.
His options are now simple. He and his army must support themselves in this foreign land.
Yep.
Or perish.
Napoleon doesn't despair, come on now.
While General Desaix is sent south in pursuit of Murat.
By the way, Desaix is one of those generals who you don't really see much of, more broadly in the Napoleonic Wars. He doesn't become one of Napoleon's most important subordinates more broadly, but in terms of the Egyptian expedition, he is pretty important. He does play a key role. We're seeing a part of that here.
At bay, Napoleon sets about reforming the administration of Egypt.
Once again, he did it in Italy, he did it in Malta, now he's doing it in Egypt. Wherever Napoleon goes, he brings sort of reform and this liberal Enlightenment policy.
The old feudal system is abolished. A postal service and hospitals are set up, and a new tax system introduced. Napoleon establishes the Institute of Egypt for scientific and scholarly research. He shows great interest in and respect for Islam, funding the construction of mosques and encouraging the observance of religious festivals.
So this is a really interesting one, Napoleon's relationship with Islam. Some people even claim that Napoleon actually converted, but this is not true. Or at least I do not think it's true, and most people don't think it's true either. Now, what did Napoleon do? He portrayed himself as a real friend of Islam, at times even maybe implying conversion or implying that he was more than just a friend to Islam. He was a Muslim. Sometimes he would sign his name Napoleon Ali Bonaparte, right? The implication there is no, I'm part of this religion, I'm part of this culture. And he does seem to have some interest in Islam. He studied the Quran, he had some interest in the religion and the history, but he does not end up converting, right? Overall, I mean, Napoleon, he's not entirely irreligious. And as he grows older, he does become more religious, but he is quite a secular individual, especially in his younger years. He's pretty secular. He's not a massive fan of organized religion. I don't think he would, in my opinion, change that to convert to Islam. I think he respected the Prophet Muhammad a lot, but I think he respected him sort of as a general and political leader and historical figure, not necessarily as a religious figure, right? And plus the fact that, Napoleon will leave Egypt, go back to Europe, and live for, 2 more decades, roughly, and we don't really have any evidence that he actually converted to Islam. So, yeah, this is not true. He did not convert, and I think this is mostly, opportunism, right? Is Napoleon trying to appeal to the local population? Though, like I said, he seems to have had some genuine interest in Islam. And he does talk about it quite favorably and quite positively. But, I think this is mainly Napoleon doing what Napoleon does, which is using ideology to benefit his own ambition. In my opinion, he is kind of challenging with Napoleon at points, because at times he is ideological. I mean, we can see in this era of Napoleon, he is still very much committed to sort of the Enlightenment revolutionary ideals of the French Revolution. And a big question people ask, especially as time goes on, is is he really committed to that, or is that just a tool for his advancement? I think it's tricky. I think, as with all things, it's a mix, right? It's a mix of Napoleon really having these ideals, really finding Islam interesting, and then using it to advance personally and using it for his own ambition. I think he's a fascinating and very complicated character.
Such engagement later leads to rumours that Napoleon actually converted to Islam.
Right.
But it is merely a tactic to curry local favour.
It's not true. He does not convert.
Napoleon also grapples with news that his wife, Josephine, has resumed her affair with an ex-lover. It is, he's told, common knowledge amongst Paris society. He consoles himself with affairs of his own, including one with an officer's wife.
Yeah, so in the Ridley Scott's movie, basically the one and only reason Napoleon leaves Egypt is because he finds out his wife is cheating on him. That is not true. That is a vast oversimplification. Now, he is very upset to learn Josephine has been cheating, and I mean, he's not happy, absolutely. And maybe that plays a role in one of the reasons why but the reason Napoleon goes back to France, as we'll eventually get to, there's a whole host of reasons. And it's not like he hears about Josephine cheating and he immediately is on a boat back to France. So that was a very silly part of the movie, I thought. But yes, he does hear about Josephine cheating. He's very unhappy. And I assume the mistress they're talking about is Pauline Forez. I think you pronounce her name. And she was married to a French officer. And there's actually some sort of awkward drama that happens involving all of that. We covered that a bit in the Extra History series. But by the way, she is sort of a fascinating character in herself. She will, not at this point, but later become a novelist and a businesswoman in Brazil. Really, really fascinating stuff. But yeah, Napoleon takes her as a mistress during this time. Perhaps in response to Josephine cheating on him. Though I believe he also took mistresses in Italy as well, so this is not really a new thing for Napoleon.
All the while, French efforts to win over the local population are failing.
Yeah, they're not working.
Most Egyptians see only foreign occupiers and infidels.
Yeah, and I assume we're building up to the rebellion, and sort of when you look at it from their perspective, you can't really blame them. First of all, Napoleon tries to frame himself as a friend of Islam, maybe implying a little more, but at the end of the day, he and his men are not Muslim, and they refuse to convert. Some of the imams of Al-Azhar say, all right, well, why don't you convert to Islam? And Napoleon refuses, I think partially because that would not be good for his reputation back in Europe. Europe is very Islamophobic, if Napoleon converted to Islam, I think that would really be bad for his opportunities back home. And also, most of his men don't want to convert to Islam, right? Some of them are more like secular, liberal, revolutionary types, but a lot of them are Catholic. And also, they love to drink, and they don't want to observe the no alcohol rule that comes with Islam. So, he refuses to convert, essentially. And so, to the locals, they're like, okay, he keeps telling us that, oh, I'm a friend of Islam, a defender of the faith, but this isn't true. We know this isn't true. And then also, he's bringing all these things, but once again, it's a question of, okay, you're bringing all these liberal reforms, but do the people actually want them? And if not, then all you are is just a foreign occupier who's doing things that they don't want. There's also the taxes. Napoleon brings in this sort of liberal tax system that includes property taxes on the population. They don't like this. They say, hey, wait a minute. These are taxes reserved for the Jewish and Christian populations, and now you're applying them to us. This is extremely offensive. Now, of course, I think from our perspective and from Napoleon's perspective, he's like, well, I'm making the tax system fair and modern, and that's great. And I mean, I would agree with him there. I don't think there should be different taxes based on religion, but that's not how the local population sees it, right? That's not how they see it. In addition, in the fall of 1798, plague begins to strike Egypt, which is, definitely causes more unrest and perhaps is interpreted as by some as evidence that God is displeased with what's going on. So all of these things, and just the essential fact that this is a foreign occupation, the Egyptian population is not happy, and unrest continues to grow.
The situation is already at boiling point. Minor revolts break out across the Nile Delta, which are brutally suppressed by the French.
Crushed by the French. But once again, that probably doesn't help either. We can see Napoleon does the same thing in Italy. We saw that in their series on Napoleon's Italian campaign, which is Napoleon's whole thing is he goes, I'm here to bring enlightenment and civilization and liberalism, and if you work with me, great, we'll be fine. But if you resist, I will brutally crush you. And we saw examples of that in Italy. And, the same thing happens here.
Then in September, from Constantinople, Sultan Selim III declares a holy war against the French.
Yeah.
Now, the situation in Egypt is about to explode.
It's actually interesting. The French and the Ottoman Empire were actually on friendly terms before this. They were actually allies, and the French, in their invasion of Egypt, they actually considered trying to buy it from the Ottomans. Now, the Ottomans don't really control Egypt. It's autonomous under the Mamelukes, but they still officially control it. And the French decide not to buy it from the Ottomans because they say, well, they don't control it anyway, so what's the point? We're going to have to conquer it ourselves, regardless of if we buy it or not. And They even sort of convinced themselves that, well, sure, this is sort of an infringement on Ottoman sovereignty, but they have a lot of issues with Egypt anyway. They won't be too mad, right? The whole, we're not going to ask them if we can go do it, but we'll probably be fine afterwards. The French invade Egypt, and of course the Ottomans are furious. Selim III takes this as a massive offense, and he declares war on the French, but also, using his position as Caliph of the Islamic world, which is a pretty big deal, he basically calls on all Muslims to oppose the French occupation. Now, for a population so religious, that's really bad for the French. Any sort of authority Napoleon might have gained by, pretending or really being some sort of friend of Islam, he's now quickly losing with stuff like that. Let all those who believe that there is but one God take themselves to the Al-Azhar Mosque, for today is the day to fight the infidel. So, Sheikh of Al-Azhar, we can see the framing used here. This is very much framed in a religious way. They are not buying Napoleon's protestations that, no, I'm a friend of it. They're saying, no, you're not. This is not true. And the Sheikh of Al-Azhar and, a lot of the imams some imams call for peace and try to discourage the brewing unrest. But others, I think especially those in Al-Azhar, call to fight the infidel, fight the French occupation for our religion, for Allah.
Cairo, the 21st of October, 1798. General Dupuy, Cairo's military governor, is called out to break up a disturbance.
Uh-oh.
He finds the locals erecting barricades. Is set up.
I mean, I gotta say, I think the locals might be taking a bit of a cue from the French. What is more French than starting a revolt and putting up barricades in the streets? You know what I mean? They should be getting along. They have so much in common. Of course, that is not how the French occupiers see it.
And killed.
Oh, yeah, Dupuy gets
Soon
murdered.
the whole city is up in arms. The French fight back with ruthless discipline and crush the revolt.
And one of Joseph Solkowski, I think, one of Napoleon's close aides and a good friend is actually killed during this revolt. So Dupuy and one of Napoleon's close aides. So, overall, as we'll see, the French don't take too many casualties, but hey, some important people are lost.
Some 300 French soldiers are killed, alongside several thousand Egyptians.
Wow.
Napoleon ostentatiously pardons the ringleaders, while quietly telling Berthier that every rioter caught with a weapon is to be beheaded and thrown into the Nile.
Yeah.
The French have bloodily reasserted control in Cairo. But it is clear, Napoleon will never win the hearts and minds of the Egyptians.
Yeah, this is in some ways the ends of the Hearts and Minds campaign. And what actually happens, by the way, because they sort of brushed over it a little bit, is that this rebellion, as we saw, is very much formed around Al-Azhar, this very important Islamic mosque. And, the people rise up in the city, and the French, crush this revolt, push them back, until the rebels are basically pushed into the Al-Azhar mosque. Napoleon surrounds it with men and artillery, and then bombards this, we talk about the Hearts and Minds campaign ending, he bombards the Al-Azhar mosque, and then storms in, putting an end to the rebellion, and overall, I think it's like about 5,000 of the rebels, and like they said, there's sort of this gracious pardon, but then they end up executing basically anybody who's involved in this rebellion. So, it is a really brutal French crushing of this uprising, and yeah, it does not really improve Franco-Egyptian relations.
The next few months see the French languish in Cairo.
Yeah.
There is limited communication with France, much homesickness, and a dwindling supply of stores, ammunition, and wine. There is also an outbreak of bubonic plague.
There's the plague.
Which torments the army and further thins its ranks.
Yeah, once again, the plague, not good for the Egyptians, not good for the French, and I think, judging from the length of this video, next time we'll talk more about the impact of the plague.
The only action is in the south, where General Desaix's column, 2,800 men, pursue Murad Bey deep into Upper Egypt. In this epic chase, one officer distinguishes himself. A 28-year-old cavalry brigadier named Louis Nicolas Davout.
Interesting.
On the 22nd of January 1799, he and Desaix inflict a serious defeat on Murad Bey, scattering his remaining forces.
Yeah.
Murad himself escapes and remains at large.
Once again, whenever we have sort of a ground battle between the French and the Mamelukes, the French dominate, and this continues to be the case. The issues with the Egyptian expedition are not that France is, or Napoleon, I should say, is struggling to defeat the Mamelukes. No, there's a whole host of other things that are really big problems, as we've seen throughout this video.
But such military victories do little to change the outlook for Napoleon's expedition.
That's exactly. This is kind of one of the interesting things. Shows you how maybe how would you put it? The tactical situation can be different from the strategic one, or maybe how the military situation can be different from the political situation, in that, Napoleon is winning all of these battles, really major victories against the Mamelukes, and this expedition overall is not going well. And, ultimately it's sort of doomed in the long run. But he has all these victories, as you would expect from Napoleon, but in the end, it's not going to bring him much.
They remain 1,600 miles from France, with no prospect of reinforcements or getting home.
Yeah, that hasn't
Napoleon
changed.
briefly puts his hopes on a diplomatic solution. France's foreign minister, the brilliant, urbane and slippery Charles Maurice de Talleyrand.
Don't put your hopes on Talleyrand, I can tell you that. Look, this guy's brilliant, as they said. A brilliant diplomat, minister, politician. One of the most untrustworthy men of the era, frankly. When you think about this era of European politics, Talleyrand, they use the word slippery, brilliant. I think he's been described before as a cockroach. This man survives anything. He works through several French regimes. I think it might end up being like 4, 5, 6, something like that. He serves in several of these regimes. Regimes that hate each other because he is so slippery. He will betray one and move on to the other. So Talleyrand is brilliant and he achieves great things, but don't put your faith in Talleyrand, because whenever he thinks he has a better opportunity, he moves. Talleyrand himself would frame it as, I do what's best for France. Now, if that means moving to a new government, I'll do that. Yeah, I think Talleyrand did what was best for Talleyrand.
Had been an early supporter of the Egyptian expedition. He's assured Napoleon that he will personally travel to Constantinople to smooth relations with the Sultan and win Egypt for France.
Yeah, so this is the line of thinking that some of the French are still pursuing, that they can go to Constantinople and convince the Sultan, not to be mad. It's pretty ridiculous. Obviously he's mad, and obviously he's going to do something about this, right? I think the French basically went forward with this, justified it in their heads, but then when it actually happened, the Sultan was like, yeah, no, I'm not going to accept this. Like, what? Like, you've just infringed my territory. Of course I'm not going to accept this, which is, understandable and very foreseeable, frankly.
But Talleyrand never leaves Paris. The Sultan remains furious at France's attack on his Egyptian province.
Yeah, and I'm not sure how much. Maybe Talleyrand could have worked some magic, but I'm really not sure how much he could have done. And I don't know why he didn't end up going, but maybe one of the reasons he didn't go is because he didn't really have a chance of fixing the situation politically.
There is to be no negotiation and no compromise. Orders have gone out to every corner of the Ottoman Empire to raise troops to drive out the French invader.
Yep. So we've been fighting against the Mamelukes, we've been fighting against the British, now the Ottomans are getting involved. Yeah, this expedition is starting to look worse by the day.
Napoleon's position looks more desperate than it's ever been.
True.
His troops cut off, disease-ridden, in the midst of a hostile population. He will respond in the way that seems obvious to him, as it would to his hero Alexander. He will attack.
Of course. Of course.
One of the most important skills for any historian is to be able to critically evaluate sources of information.
True.
Who's sharing it? Why? And what's their bias? Napoleon himself, for example, was a notoriously unreliable narrator of his own life.
Oh, absolutely.
Today,
this man was a spinster. He would spin any event to frame him positively.
Need these critical skills just to navigate the media landscape. Take the war in Ukraine. Anyone following the conflict
All right, I believe we're getting to an advertisement. Yes, we are. So I will, there you go. So, go and check out Epic History TV's video. It's linked down below. Give them a like, subscribe, and check out their sponsor, right? Especially this is a newer video. Y'all should go and watch the video and support them. We want to show them that we appreciate them making these fantastic videos, because I think they've done a really good job with this one. I very much enjoyed this video. I think, as you might be able to tell, I think the Egyptian expedition is really fascinating. And we've covered it in the past. And I think it's a very interesting expedition. It tells us, and it's not necessarily, the most important part of Napoleon's career. In fact, it's one of the least important parts, sort of, in terms of, like, his bigger campaigns. But I think it's really interesting. Lets us learn a lot about France, a lot about the sort of intellectual space, the growing Orientalism, a lot about Egypt, the Ottoman Empire. We're bringing some really interesting stuff into this one. By the way, if you guys are interested in this, there's a great podcast called, I think it's The Age of Napoleon, that does a really great job covering Napoleon, the French Revolutionary Wars, his Italian campaign, Egyptian campaign, that I've not listened to at the moment, but was listening to a couple months ago, and it's really, definitely give it my recommendation, at least the first sort of couple dozen episodes. I haven't finished it. But yeah, very much enjoyed this video. I thought they did a good job. There's a lot of interesting stuff here. There's a lot of interesting stuff to come. Some fascinating events, political stuff, military stuff. Of course, the question of sort of why in the end this fails and why in the end Napoleon leaves. We've got some in the... I'm assuming they're making a series, or at least another part out of this. I guess this might just be a two-part series, considering how much we covered in this one. But yeah, there's a whole lot more to cover that is really interesting to me. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this one. I was yapping a lot, but I find this fascinating. If you did, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a like, subscribe, check out the Patreon linked down below, all that good stuff. I hope you guys are all having a good day today, and I will see you again next time. Goodbye.